The Ruined King, a name that has a long and storied history not just in the world of Runeterra, but in real life as well. Long before his addition to the game as a champion, before even the Great Retcon, the Ruined King was an enigmatic figure in League's lore. He was referenced in champion bios, shop items, and even NPC dialogue on the now-defunct Twisted Treeline map. Precious little was known about him, aside from the fact that he's responsible for the curse of undeath that plagues the Shadow Isles, a curse brought about from trying to resurrect a dead queen. Since 2012, the Ruined King has been a background character in the story, an enigmatic figure believed to lurk at the heart of the Shadow Isles. His name, appearance, everything about him really, was a complete mystery. Countless fan theories and interpretations rose over the years as to this figure's true identity. Some speculated that he had secluded himself in the midst of his own folly, ruminating over a failed attempt to revive the woman he loved. Others thought that he might still be trying to bring his queen back, biding his time until the black mist grew strong enough to do so. The king's true nature, his role in the story, all of it was left up to interpretation. And then, in 2021, it happened. The Lord of the Shadow Isles, after being kept in the dark for so many years, was revealed to us. And he was a goth pretty boy. Yeah, not at all what people expected, although character design really isn't my forte. If you want a more nuanced breakdown of Viego's design, I'd recommend TV Skyne's video on the subject. For now, let's focus on the character's history instead, both in-universe and out of it. So shortly after his reveal, Riot announced an entire video game that was going to be centered around Viego, as the antagonist. A game fittingly titled The Ruined King. The game follows a cast of miscellaneous champions from various different regions, banding together to fight back against Viego and his never-ending tide of undead horrors. And while I won't spoil anything for those of you who haven't played it, let's just say that it ends about how you'd expect. See, there's this sort of unwritten rule that champions in League of Legends have plot armor. That no one in this roster of over 140 characters is actually allowed to permanently die. Because, let's face it, how awkward would that be? Everyone is someone's favorite champion, and even if the game itself isn't canon, I don't imagine too many people would be pleased if their main was killed off. I mean, say we got a story in which Rengar finally kills Kha'Zix. That would be cool, but it would also suck for Kha'Zix fans and leave Rengar without his rival to try and surpass. It's an issue with League's story that I think deserves its own video later on, but suffice it to say, Viego being introduced as a champion means he's never going to truly die, and the best you can do is imprison him for a time. Case in point, Rise of the Sentinels. Probably the worst lore event Riot has ever done, with a myriad of problems that have already been discussed ad nauseum by myself and various other YouTubers. What's important to keep in mind here is that the event more or less ends exactly like the Ruined King game. A group of random champions from different regions team up to imprison Viego, because we can't actually kill him off and free the Shadow Isles from his curse. The difference is that the Ruined King game was actually written somewhat competently, and Sentinels, not so much. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back and talk a bit about Viego's lore. Normally, I'd have various iterations of a champion's backstory to go through, but thankfully, Viego only has one bio, being a relatively newer addition to the roster. The story goes as thus. Viego was the second son of the King of Camavor, a nation that lies somewhere beyond the eastern edge of Runeterra's current world map. He was never meant to inherit the throne, and so spent his days indulging in all the luxuries that royalty afforded him. Then Viego's brother died for unknown reasons, and so Viego was made king, despite lacking any of the qualities that would make for a competent ruler. Also, at some point, his uncle Vladimir was sold off to be enslaved by a Darkin. Don't worry about it. Anyways, the point is that Viego more or less continued to indulge his own fancies, and that includes marrying a young seamstress girl by the name of Isolde. Now, ordinarily, this would be more or less impossible. After all, while a handsome prince sweeping a village girl off her feet to a life of luxury is a nice fairy tale, the politics of medieval kingdoms don't normally allow those of high standing to marry for the sake of love. Isolde was no noble, had no experience with governance, and certainly didn't meet the qualifications one would expect of a future queen. And yet, Viego was king now, and he wasn't about to let anyone tell him what he could and couldn't do. Viego took Isolde as his bride, and did everything in his power to ensure her happiness, at the expense of the kingdom he was meant to rule. Needless to say, this earned Viego, and even Isolde, many enemies. Camavor was falling apart under Viego's poor governance, but all he cared about was doting on his wife. We all know the story from here. Isolde was struck by a dagger meant for Viego, he became obsessed with saving, then resurrecting her, found the Blessed Isles, and then unleashes a curse of undeath that creates the Shadow Isles. The Ruined King game happens, Sentinels of Light happens, and Viego gets trapped in Camavor's ruins. Sorry for kind of blitzing through things, but I imagine we all kind of know the story by now. With that being said, let's address the core of Viego's character. The Ruined King is a concept we've all seen done before. A person overcome with grief, who's trying to defy the rules of life and death to bring someone precious back to them. This is typically done at the expense of others, and against the will of the one being resurrected. More often than not, this has drastic consequences for the world as a whole, and winds up being a self-defeating motivation. Even if the villain's plan succeeds, the person they were trying to bring back rejects them, making that much sought-after reunion brief at best. The real threat with these sorts of antagonists is not their goal in and of itself, but how much damage they can and will inflict to achieve it. That is where I think Viego's story falters, a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes him a threat. The Sentinels of Light event focuses entirely on this big race around Runeterra to gather the scattered fragments of Isolde's soul before Viego does. But there's really no point. There are no stakes in Viego bringing Isolde back, as we establish that even she doesn't want to be revived if it means shrouding the world in endless darkness. As I said before, it's a self-defeating agenda, and ultimately the Sentinels aren't even the ones who beat Viego. He defeats himself by failing to put his wife's thoughts and feelings above his own. In the end, Isolde tells Akshan to shoot her with the Absolver, a convoluted plot device that breaks her soul apart again and revives Senna and Gwen through a weird series of technicalities and loopholes. Gwen then binds Viego in hallowed threads and leaves him tied up there in Camavor, because I guess he's too strong to finish off even though he's now completely helpless and without the will to fight. And that's where we leave Viego, a character who no longer has any purpose in the lore. His plans are in ruins, the woman he wanted to revive has rejected him, and he's helplessly bound in the remnants of his dead kingdom. Even if Viego gets free, what exactly can he do? Just try and bring Isolde back again, even though he now knows that she won't accept him? What's more, Thresh technically rules the Shadow Isles now, because I guess you can just steal control of the Black Mist away from Viego. Now, it does seem like the writers have something in mind for the Ruined King. Nyla is rather concerned about him being left so close to her home of Kathkan, and it's been established that the Black Mist has an adverse effect on demons that can drive them into a berserk state. This seems to imply that Viego will somehow be tied into the demon storyline at some point, Though to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if even Riot hasn't thought that far ahead. So, where does that leave us? To be honest, it's hard to imagine how you can salvage Viego at this point. I do have 3 possibilities in mind, however. The first is simply that you have him freed and continue his pointless quest to get his soul back. If you do this, however, then you need to fully lean into the idea that Viego views his soul as a prize, something to possess and nothing more. This is the direction I went for my own Rise of the Sentinels rewrite, in which Viego tries to absorb or assimilate Isolde's soul into him, thus ensuring they can literally never be apart again. You could also say that doing this makes the Black Mist stronger, thus giving us an actual reason for wanting to protect Isolde from her toxic ex. Option 2 is to use Viego as a means of advancing the demon storyline. The guy is literally filled with misery and anguish, so I imagine demons could be drawn quite readily to all the negative emotions wafting off of Viego. Perhaps Ashlesh decides that Viego could use a little joy in his life. Or maybe Viego even pursues Nyla in the hopes that her demon can give him back some shred of happiness now that he's lost the one thing that drove him. Or hell, maybe Viego draws the attention of another demon altogether. I mean, it's not confirmed what the other 8 represent, but with fear and joy being 2 very potent base emotions, I think it makes sense to have a demon of sorrow or rage clinging to Viego, feeding off the Black Mist and becoming more feral as a result. The last option, also something I touched on in my Sentinel rewrite, is the idea of bringing Mordekaiser into the fray. Now, I admit I'm a touch iffier on this idea than when I first came up with it, but I still think it makes way too much sense. I mean, who wouldn't want to see the actual Emperor of Death show up and put this upstart princeling in his place? I imagine Mordekaiser would find the Black Mist a useful means of spreading his own power and influence, while Viego is just kept as a prisoner to empower him. You could possibly even use this as the beginning of a potential redemption arc for Viego, though whether or not that in itself is a good idea can be left up for debate. But as things stand, I don't imagine Riot is too eager to touch Viego at all right now. The lingering contempt of the Sentinels event will likely always loom over the Shadow Isle storyline, and every character connected to it suffers as a result. Still, the best we can hope for is that one day Riot will be able to give Viego the arc he truly deserves. I think it's safe to say that, after almost an entire decade of build-up, the Ruined King is owed at least that much.